should we decrease or stop matching the Russians in nuclear technology?
We have about 30,000 nuclear weapons today. The Soviet Union has 20,000.
If you're obliterated 46 times, what difference does it make if he gets you the second time?
What do you suggest that we do as individuals?
I suggest that, all of us in this country ought to get very active. And the first thing I do is call the White House, call the President.
And we hope you'll join us. Here's who's here. Larry Smarr is an astrophysicist. He's with the Illinois Alliance to Prevent Nuclear War. He did everything his parents told him to do. He studied very hard, and he now is a very respected member of the community of physicists and particles and Einstein and all that good stuff that totaled most of us in school. He's also here to tell you that what he knows about energy and nuclear matter is ominous in terms of the results of a nuclear encounter. And he wants to stop what he considers is this unnecessary, mindless spiraling of the arms race. Admiral Jean LaRocque joins us as Center for Defense Information, Washington, D.C. Say what you want about this man. He has served his country. As a kid, how old were you in Pearl Harbor?
22.
He was at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese bombed the island, and so many young men lost their lives. So he knows what it's like to be in the middle of this thing. And he is not a mindless pacifist. He believes we have to be strong, but he thinks the approach we're taking is inefficient, wasteful, and dangerous. You recognize Paul Newman, who is proud to claim United States citizenship. You know that he also has exercised his right and what he believes to be his obligation to speak out about something that's very, very important to him. He does not apologize for the popularity that his screen career has engendered, and he asks you not to penalize him if he happens to draw a crowd. He'd also like you to know that he's not the first Hollywood person to speak out on issues or perform a public service. We happen to have one member of his former professional community in the White House today. Let me start with the Admiral here. The Russians have almost 300 SS-20s in Eastern Russia, pointed at NATO countries, each with 3 warheads, longer range even than the cruise or our Pershing. So we should sit there and say, okay, go ahead, Russia, deploy all you want. It isn't necessarily then totally misunderstood why we should want to ensure that Russia knows we're ready and to prevent them from pushing their own nuclear buttons. That's why we have missiles landing in West Germany and England and Sicily.
Phil, the problem is that if you try to narrow it down to just one new type of system or something else, you ignore the really dangerous problem. We have about 30,000 nuclear weapons today. The Soviet Union has 20,000. That's 50,000. Our nuclear weapons are being made more accurate, shorter time of flight, less response time. They go in under the radars. What I'm saying is the character of weapons is changing to such an extent that it makes nuclear war more likely because we're putting a hair trigger on the nuclear forces on both sides. And somewhere we must stop this upward spiral, otherwise we're going to have a nuclear war.
I'd also like to point out that people talk about 6-to-1 advantage in intermediate range weapons in Europe. Though that doesn't mean anything. We've got 3,000 warheads sitting off the coast in submarines, so we got a 6-to-1 advantage. But what do all those figures mean? They really don't mean anything. I mean, if you're obliterated 46 times, what difference does it make if he gets you the second time?
I'm sorry?
It only takes one.
Therefore what?
We don't need all of those.
That's right. That's absolutely
If you're
right.
so smart,
How come you aren't president?
if you're so smart, how come all those blue suits who study this stuff, have the maps and the reconnaissance and the technology and the secret, don't know that?
I'm only a bystander.
Well, Phil, there's a good reason.
It's your country.
There's a good reason that they've been locked in to a system. The military has a job to do. That's to acquire weapons to fight wars with. And unfortunately, they have treated nuclear weapons as if They were battleships, bullets, etc. And therefore, they want all they can get. And that's what the military is there for. But it's up to the people of the United States, to the Congress of the United States, to set policy. And in this question of nuclear war, if we don't put a halt to this new kind of nuclear war fighting, which we're moving into, we are going to guarantee that we have a nuclear war.
But the lady's right, Phil, and this is very important. It only takes one, because when you explode that first one, then there'll be more that follow, and the whole world then crumbles.
Yeah.
It only takes one.
I think the lady is also right when she says, I am only a bystander. I think she's right in the sense that that is how she feels. And I think in that sense she speaks for millions of Americans who can watch all the talk shows they want with a bunch of folks gathered in a good old CBS studio in Chicago. Ain't it awful? And the argument will be predictable. Some will stand and say we have to be ready. Others will say this is terrible. The reality of life is that the people whose democracy this is supposed to be feel they've lost control of it, and in effect are assuming the posture of a bystander, making no contribution at all.
I think they feel that they've lost control about it simply because they're not noisy enough. Now, the polls have shown that somewhere between 70 and 80% of the American people favor a freeze, a mutual freeze, and a bilateral freeze of nuclear weapons and testing and deployment and so forth. If those voices aren't heard, if they're not noisy enough, then they're really silent participants in democracy. They're not making their presence felt.
Yeah. We've seen a number of demonstrations of what many would call real courage in Europe, in both England and Germany. We have some folks are getting jerked around pretty good by the local constable, being thrown in jail for protesting the arrival of America's military nuclear hardware. This woman doesn't want to do that. She doesn't want to get thrown in a paddy wagon. Huh?
Right.
See how well I speak for this populace here? In other words, it seems that you either do that, you either put your parka on and your peace symbol and get dragged away in a peaceful demonstration, or you do nothing.
Look, the women of America have had an opportunity before and have been incredibly successful at making a change in nuclear policy. We've been seeing all these movies about JFK, and remember that what he called his proudest achievement was getting a limited test ban agreement with the Russians to halt nuclear testing in the atmosphere. He could do that because the women of America were tired of being told that their kids couldn't go out and eat snow because it had strontium-90 in it. They were trying to figure out how to get powdered milk from South America where the cows didn't eat radioactive grass. And because they got very active, they weren't in the streets, they weren't in chains, but they made their voices heard. Kennedy and the Congress heard them, and we got a limited test ban. We've done it before, you can do it again, but you've got to make your voice heard.
What do you do besides write your congressman?
There's
What
a lot
else can you do?
There's a great deal you can do. In fact, one thing that the Center for Defense Information has done is make a very nice booklet on what citizens can do to make their voice heard in this matter.
We'll be happy to give you that address.
I disagree a little bit that it's so much the people of America. I think we need to have the comfort of feeling the people of the world would like to see this stop. You know, for us to come out and say it's all our responsibility, the women of America, the people of America, the world has to be with us on this.
Well,
We feel comfortable in stopping this, that they're going to stop it too.
5 weeks ago, I was in Bonn, Germany, addressing 500,000 people in Germany assembled to protest the introduction of the crews and the Pershings into Europe, really to protest what they saw as the likelihood of a nuclear war.
And another thing, you know, the people of America, the citizens of America, have got an opportunity that's never existed before, and that is that we literally, by the power of our participation, can control what's going on in the world. Now, if we, in other words, it doesn't make any difference that the citizens in Russia don't have a voice in their government, because in the final analysis, SALT I was passed because the Russians found that it was to their advantage as well as ours to try to put some kind of lid on nuclear weapons. So that the citizens themselves don't participate in Russia or some of the eastern countries is not necessarily relevant.
The problem is we're the ones that are paying for all the bombs to be made, and we're the ones that are going to get wiped out. And then you're telling us to oppose something that we're paying for.
You're suckers.
Right. I mean,
It just doesn't make sense.
there are $450 billion that are going to be spent by the Congress of the United States in the next 10 years.
We should spend more money then to protect ourselves, maybe buy all...
That's what your president is saying he's doing.
well, he's protected. What about us?
You're
He's
not.
saying that this military buildup is an effort to ensure parity, at least parity with the Soviet Union and protect.
We should wipe out what we already built, and then we don't have to.
That's absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
That'll do about a 4 on the applause meter. What's the matter? What's the matter?
Wait a minute. I don't know much about it. You're saying wipe out everything we have. Now, if we wipe out everything we have, that lets us open for the Gaddafis and those people in the Middle East who, I think, feel differently about a different way of life than we do.
Right.
And I think we have to keep it at a certain level. I mean, you say wipe out everything we have. I totally disagree with that.
President Reagan actually called for that in a speech the other day. He said that he had a dream in which we would get rid of all nuclear weapons on this planet.
Well, that would be great, but then again, you really believe, I don't know, the Russians have never proven in the course of history that they are really trustworthy people all the time.
Right. I think the point is that where we are now is at such an elevated level over anything that makes any sense, even from a deterrence point of view, that both we and the Russians would be very glad to reduce that number substantially. We have 10,000 weapons that can explode over their country. They have 8,000 that can explode over our country. Believe me, if they knew that they were going to have 1,000 American weapons that could explode over their country rather than 10,000, they would see that in their self-interest. Okay? They would be happy to make an agreement like that if we would pull down the number of our weapons and they would pull down the number approaching us. I don't think there would be that much of a difficulty in getting that kind of agreement if we want it.
Over here.
Okay, we're talking about the bomb or the missiles with Russia and the United States, but we've forgotten something. My concern is not so much Russia and the United States, or the small countries
Absolutely.
in the East.
Yeah.
And they're, fanatics over there. And I feel like...
So how do you protect
Well, I'll tell you
yourself
one
against-
thing. If there's an arms race going on between the Soviet Union and the United States, it's pretty hard for us to exercise our control or our power over Pakistan or Brazil or Argentina or anything if we're in a big scrap ourselves. The best way to control proliferation in the smaller countries is to exert some kind of influence or control over ourselves, isn't it?
Is the caller there? Hello? Is the caller there? We'd wait for you. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, these men are talking about a verifiable treaty with Russia. I think what the American people need to know is how we're going to be assured that Russia is going to hold to a treaty.
Right.
Well, I'll answer that.
We can't trust the Russians, therefore, I think it's folly to try and negotiate an agreement with them.
Well,
Agreement.
if you think it's folly to try to negotiate a treaty with the Russians, then I suggest that you go down and picket the White House, because that's exactly what President Reagan is trying to do, or at least that's what he tells us he's trying to do. Now we have, sure, I'm here, I'm around, but we have 3 treaties with Russia right now: the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the comprehensive treaty in the air, and SALT I. Now, there's a group in Geneva, the Standing Consultative Committee. They apparently have had 8 accusations of faults on our side and 6 on the Soviet side. It's all come to a perfect agreement. We said, you've been doing this, and they stopped doing what they were doing, and they said, you've been doing...
There's no treaty that is based on trust with the Russians. We don't sign such treaties. We don't make such treaties. The reason you have such a long time in negotiating these things in Geneva is to craft a treaty which we can verify by ourselves, even if the Russians try and violate.
That's what
we
treaties
check
are
them.
for. They're between people that don't trust each other. Yeah.
True, I can see that with treaties. But when you talk about cutting back on the nuclear things, when only a few are going to do such destruction, what difference does it make whether you have 5 or whether you have 1,000?
Could I say a little bit about that? You've heard of the nuclear winter that Carl Sagan and 100 other scientists have developed. What that showed us for the first time is that there is a number of nuclear weapons which, if we have more than that, will bring not only destruction to the United States and Soviet Union, but to all life on Earth. Could I have...
Yeah, let's see that tape, Ronnie. The darkness spreading south. This is
Okay,
this
here
is an
you
artist
see-
rendering of what you say as an astrophysicist will have.
As the missiles hit the cities burn, and that black you see is the soot from burning cities all over the Earth. enveloping the Earth in a blanket of darkness that plunges temperatures to sub-freezing for months on end. If we used our entire arsenal that we have now on both sides, the surface of the Earth could go as low as the surface of Mars in its temperature, killing all plant life and animal life on the Earth. Now that's what our current arsenal will do.
That scares me. I think that's awful. I don't want it to happen, but tell that to the Russians. And the only way you negotiate, the only way you can deal with the Russians and ensure that doesn't happen is to make sure you communicate strength to them.
The Russian scientists have independently done these calculations and have told their leaders.
In the beginning, Gene alluded to some shows of strength. What other shows of strength does the United States have other than nuclear weapons to let the Russians know that we really...
You think that is the only show?
No, no. I mean, I want an alternative to it, but I mean, I don't see any other. Nothing has been brought up by the government or...
Do you buy this thing? You can't trust the Russians, therefore it's folly to negotiate with them?
No, I think we should negotiate, but we've got to be very, very strong. But I don't know what else is a source of strength.
Do you support the deployment of the cruise and the Pershing missiles in Europe?
I don't know any other alternatives.
You think we need them there, though?
Yes, until we get another show of strength. What other alternatives are there? That's what I want to know.
We trust the Russians right now because the Russians have
Let me tell them who we
8,500 nuclear weapons aimed at us, and there's nothing that we can do to prevent their missiles from landing on the United States right now, today, if they so choose to do it. So it is only in our interest to work out agreements where we limit the number of weapons that we have and they limit the number of weapons they have till we finally come down to zero. I don't like the idea of recognizing that my life is dependent upon someone in Russia right now who I've got to trust that they won't make a mistake, that they won't have a computer failure, they won't have some sort of accident.
You are Richard Gardner, MD, physician. You're a member of Physicians for Social Responsibility. Quite an effective and growing group of physicians who share your view that we appear to be, you know, they're threatening now. They're going to put their submarines off either coast. Now there are a number of people who will argue that they're already there. But it really does look like we've got ourselves two angry, frightened, macho guys in a room, each with a revolver, looking each other over. What, if you continuing the metaphor here, if one of the guys dozes and the other guy sneezes, this fella's going to wake up in a hurry and blow his brains out. How much are you concerned about accidental triggering of nuclear
It's
war?
worse than that because there are 95% of the people of the world who are not in the Soviet Union or the United States who are also in that room. And it's not just bullets, but it's a hand grenade in a very small room.
And the Russians are so short and quick to press a button.
As the Korean airline thing.
Their airplane got in their airway. They had no hesitations of shooting it down. They've had planes in our airway. We have two airplanes, chauffeur them back to where they belong. We don't go shooting them down.
So what's your point then? Therefore what?
How can you trust the Russians?
Right. And so you have to support then the president's effort to be strong. Is that right?
Yes, we have to be strong. I'd like to see a freeze, but how can we have a freeze if we can't depend on the Russians? We don't trust them. We don't trust them.
You want to talk to her?
We could start.
I'm sorry?
We could start by ratifying some of the treaties that we've already proposed with the Russians, that we've spent years and years working on. Our Congress won't ratify them. How can the Russians trust us?
Yeah.
The last 3 treaties that we've negotiated have not been ratified. But could I say something about this? Look, of course we don't trust the Russians, but let's not, showing strength and being stupid are 2 different things. If you don't trust somebody, if you know he's a really irascible character, if he's liable to shoot you if you look wrong at him, don't put nuclear hair triggers so that he doesn't have time to think. Don't box the Russian bear in a corner. That's what the Pershing IIs are going to do. You know, that's what the MX sitting out there looking like it's a first strike weapon is going to do. If we continue this road and we build the 5 nuclear weapons a day for the next 10 years that President Reagan has asked for and Congress is okay, that's how many the United States is building while we talk about reducing 5 a day for the next 10 years. Yeah. We are going to have the Russians sooner or later in a place where they don't have the time to think it through and all they're going to do is react and all of us are going to go down together.
Is the caller there?
I'd like to make a statement. A lot of your audiences are talking about the fact that we shouldn't trust the Russians. But one of the things that bother me is that The United States is the only country in the history of the world that has let the bomb go before. And I think that our citizens needs to ask our leaders, you know, what assurance do we have that they won't, you know, drop the bomb again?
But that's not a very realistic thing to ask a government that's spent billions in acquiring the technology.
But what I'm saying is, if we're saying constantly we don't trust the Russians. When you made the analogy of the two gentlemen with the loaded guns,
yeah.
We are the ones that have shown the history that we shot the gun before. What I'm saying is, what assurances, you know, we're talking about trusting the Russians. I'm at the point where I'm paranoid about our government.
The caller's right, because it is the policy of the United States to use nuclear weapons first. And we announced that to the whole world. The last time it was publicly done was by General Haig as Secretary of State. That's one of the hardest things for Americans to understand. It is our policy to use them first. And that creates an impression in which we may do it someday, and so the Soviets may decide to preempt in a period of crisis.
I'm not sure it's fair to lay General Haig's past statements on the current administrative
Well, it was just
policy.
a year ago. He was Secretary of State, and it is our policy.
If they take all of them away, the knowledge is still there. How can we be sure that someone, somehow, how can we be sure that knowledge will be...
If a man gets a message from God and wraps himself in a funeral shroud and gets in the driver's side of a Mercedes truck with a whole bunch of dynamite and gets in underneath the billet and kills 239 Marines and himself for the greater calling of the life hereafter, what's to prevent somebody from doing the same thing with a nuclear device? And how does disarmament or the de-escalation of the nuclear arms race prohibit or diminish that chance or possibility?
We're living in a tinderbox of 50,000 nuclear weapons. If someone gets one and uses it, that whole tinderbox is likely to go up. And so who knows who would have started it? If a weapon exploded somewhere in the United States, a nuclear weapon, it would be our assumption that it was a Soviet weapon, and that would be the end of civilization as we know it, because we would send a massive strike at the Soviet Union, they would send a massive strike back, and we would all have gone up. Having those nuclear weapons is a liability. We built them for our security.
You think terrorism is enhanced then by the proliferation of nuclear technology?
Absolutely, because it means that anyone, all of the people who we are afraid of getting nuclear weapons could have them.
We are in Chicago with some people who care and an audience who clearly cares very much, and we hope you'll join us. Hi, thanks for calling. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to direct my question to the panelists. They're talking about reducing either totally or substantially the stockpile of...
That's true. And you wanted to make what point?
Well, if you're going to do that, then where's the deterrent to keep the Russians out of Western Europe? I'd like to know how would the panelists or the people in the audience or even the American public, would they be willing to put their sons into the front lines and into West Germany to keep the Russians out?
Yeah.
Could I mention something about deterrence? That's something that word has just been totally misused. This shows the number of nuclear weapons that the United States and the Soviet Union have built from 1960 to 1982. Here's 1,000 warheads. Here's 10,000 warheads. First, you can see the United States has always been ahead of the Soviets, and that the great Soviet buildup now is a carbon copy of what we did 5 years ago. Now, down here in the yellow at the very bottom, you can hardly see it, is the region that you have to be below before you avoid the nuclear winter that Carl Sagan has been talking about. Now imagine, that's 1,000 warheads. What do you think is the 1,000th most important target in the United States? That's the number of warheads we're talking about on each side. That would certainly deter the Soviet Union from any use of a nuclear weapon against the United States if they knew that there was 1,000 weapons we could destroy on their side How many cities in Russia do you think there are?
Yeah. You think we need more, do you? Caller?
Hello? What I'm saying is, if you take, I mean, they understand the physics, we understand the physics. There's no doubt about that. But if you paralyze our response, I mean, that's the reason we have the nuclear first strike
well,
doctrine.
we're at the center of the...
How can you know, it's really interesting. How can you paralyze a response? You got 50,000 nuclear warheads. How, even if you reduced them by 25%, what would be paralyzed about it? I mean, McNamara said, give me 200 warheads, that's all I need. The other thing I'd like to address, you know, the whole psychology of this is you don't trust the Russians, you don't do this. That has been so built up in our psyche, and someone mentioned the Korean airliner. All right, the Korean airliner was shot down. There was a lot of hue and cry and moral outrage, and we got it in the United Nations and so forth. In 1978 or 79, the Israelis shot down a Libyan civilian aircraft because it had violated Israeli airspace. President Nixon sent a wire to Gaddafi and to Sadat apologizing for this incident. There was no talk about it going into the United Nations. The International Pilots Associations had their meeting. There was 102 nations that voted to condemn Israel and 4 that voted not to, and the American representative abstained. Why? Because we couldn't create an enemy there. But when the Soviets shoot down an airliner, the same situation, we rise in moral outrage against this act. What is the difference? Because it's insistent. We must insist that the Soviets have got to be created as an enemy. Otherwise, if they're not really a big enough enemy, how are we going to get appropriations for more arms? Now, and I'd like to get into the other area. I'm sorry if this is a speech and you don't like them, but people keep talking about national security, and we got to be tough, and we got to be strong. Okay, we're tough, and we're strong, and we've released all these missiles now, the intermediate range missile, the Pershing II, and we're going to have more Tridents too. And what was the Soviet response? The Soviet response is to put cruise missile into attack submarines and put more of them off our coast. Now, if someone's going to tell me that that increases our national security, well, I don't know. It's a whole ball game that I don't understand.
If Russia is on the short end of the stick as far as nuclear heads are concerned, why aren't the Russians more willing to negotiate? Why would they walk out?
Because, look, right?
Just one. I'd like, wait, one last shot and then I'll quit, all right? A month ago, there was a little article in the New York Times about Clark being moved over to the interior. One of the things that they said that this bothered the critics because his competence...
Judge William Clark, National Security Advisor, moved to Interior to replace Jim Watt.
He was a Supreme Court judge in the state of California. He had relatively no credentials, and that they were nervous about that. And that had been heightened since the president had spoken to about 30 congressmen and had said that he had just realized that the bulk of the Soviet arsenal was in heavy land-based missiles, and therefore it might have seemed a little one-sided on our part that we had called for the dismantling of these things. Now, wait a second, guys. Let's go back and look at that. That the President of the United States had just realized that the bulk of the Soviet arsenal was in land-based missiles? So if it raises the question, have we been negotiating fairly with the Soviets on anything that would make any sense to
Well, the other point, too,
we haven't been.
is SALT II was agreed to by the Russians.
Took
and
7
as you know,
years.
And our Senate has failed to ratify. So that doesn't make it right or wrong. It's just that we can't say we don't trust the Russians and then negotiate 2 important arms limitation agreements with them. You either can trust them and you negotiate, or you don't trust them, and we'll arm ourselves to the teeth.
What is trust? Can somebody explain to me what trust has to do with this? I mean, do you know what a treaty is?
Well, plenty. If you can't trust the other guy, then...
It has nothing to do, Phil, with trust. We have satellites in orbit that verify whether the Soviets deploy any new missiles in violation of the previous SALT agreements. We don't ask the Russians whether they did it. We go and look for it ourselves. And if we see them making some violations, like we recently have got some things we're unhappy about, well, we confront them with it, and they better come forward and tell us what's going on. And every case that has happened since 1963, when Kennedy did the Limited Test Ban Treaty, we have got a satisfactory answer. And now, that's a pretty good record.
And we'll be back in just a moment.
What if everybody agrees? What if we get everybody in the world to agree we're not going to do all this? What do we do with all the nuclear weapons that are here? What happens to all this?
That's a good question. There is no difficulty in dismantling the nuclear weapons. After all, remember that we have been retiring systems. For instance, the Polaris submarines have been decommissioned, their warheads have been decommissioned, and we've done that. Right? I mean, if you look on our chart here, there was a whole period from 1960 until 1970 in which the United States was retiring its first generation of bombs that it carried in the old B-47s. You remember those? Well, we did that.
That's the downslope,
that
obviously.
did that. We reduced the number of nuclear weapons, the net number of nuclear weapons. So it obviously can be done.
But you will, as an astrophysicist, proud member of the scientific community, tell this woman the truth. And that is, we don't know what we're going to do with the leftovers of nuclear technology or those nuclear armaments that we didn't use, thank God. We've got a tremendous garbage can problem on our hands.
Well, the garbage can problem is tiny compared to the worldwide garbage can that will be left over if the weapons are ever used.
But the important thing, too, Phil, is let's don't make the garbage pail any fuller. Let's stop where we are now.
The question I have is, how do you propose an efficient, ongoing system for inspection under nuclear disarmament?
Yeah, you get a mental picture of all those guys underground making all these, you know. And
no, it's very important. And I think, let me give you an example. We've got, as Admiral LaRocque has pointed out recently, in the next 10 years, the United States Congress will spend $450 billion on building up new nuclear weapons systems. How much do you think they're spending on developing better ways to verify that the Russians are abiding by the treaties?
In other words, you have...
I mean, it's just infinitesimal compared to that.
But you think we have the technology to make inspection reasonable?
Of course. And the Russians have even indicated that they would allow on-site inspection in conjunction with the underground test ban treaty that we have talked about before with them.
I thank you for calling. Are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, I have a comment to make about everyone's fears where Russia's concerned. So many people are worried about Russia. And my comment is that my husband is on a nuclear Trident submarine, one that carries 24 missiles. And I find, and he finds together as we talk about it, that more people are afraid of the sailors being on the submarines making more mistakes than Russia in itself. How do you feel about that?
Does your husband give you any reason to believe that those fears are justified?
Oh, yes, he does. We've talked about it a lot. There are a lot of young sailors who really don't understand the dangers that are involved with the nuclear warhead missiles. And he feels that a lot of people are just basically talking more than understanding that these missiles can go off at any time, loading the submarines and unloading the submarines.
You do have to wonder about the ability and the efficiency of communication. How many men on a Trident?
Approximately 140.
140.
Right.
At sea for what?
Actually, just to test the missiles. They go out to sea and they go around. They test the missiles.
But what would be a normal duration of a cruise length?
3 months.
You know, 3 months in that. And who's going to call them? And how do you know the call is from? And what if, and we just had a kid from Milwaukee who just accessed the Sloan Kettering computer.
Let me show you what would happen.
Scary. It's very, very scary.
Yeah.
Because you never know what's going to happen.
What the lady is talking about. If one of those submarines, and this is an old one, this isn't one of the Tridents, this only has 16 missiles on it. If that goes off, they're the 16 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, for instance, or in the Soviet Union, would be annihilated with 10 warheads on each city. That's one of our submarines. We have 34 of these submarines.
And this is the other thing. Is, you know, you're talking about one Poseidon submarine has, what, the about 4 times the firepower. If that detonates, in other words, it has 4 times the explosive power of everything that was detonated in World War II by both sides. That's one submarine. And if we maintain about 60% of our submarines, there's roughly 30 submarines that can hit the Soviet Union, and we're worried about intermediate range missiles in Europe, and we've got 3,000 warheads, I mean, what are we bickering about? I mean, you know, the whole concept of what is first and what is second after you reach a certain threshold is absolutely meaningless.
And we'll be back in just a moment. That, I believe, is the cruise. You've come to know it as the missile that is air-breathing and flies at low altitude to avoid enemy radar.
Hi, I would like to know about the, on Russia, how they're supposed to be building that underland, like underland, they're supposed to be building something to keep
everything out, or is it a... I haven't heard about it.
It's bomb shelters?
You mean to hide in a nuclear... Yeah, say civil defense.
I was wondering how good that's going to do if we do have a nuclear war.
Won't do a bit of good for the Soviets, and it's idiotic for us to plan on it also. Simply will not work. There's nowhere to hide in a nuclear war.
Our own American Medical Association has said that the only appropriate medical response to the threat of nuclear war is prevention. And that's why the AMA is not going into bomb shelters. It's because they know that it would be worthless, a waste of money.
Yes. I was just wondering, they keep telling us we can't trust Russia and we need to have more weapons and everything. Isn't that true? It's also good for our economy. And rather than tell us that, they produce more weapons and bolster the economy, and it looks really good. Our economy is booming. And meanwhile, we have more weapons than we need.
We made big business out of preparing for war and peacetime, and the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about is thriving and well, and is scaring the pants off the American public, so you'll give them more money to buy more weapons.
And it's also causing inflation and joblessness.
You know,
in the words of a lot of important economists and union leaders.
Historically, if you really go back and find out what Eisenhower was warning us about, we had the bomber gap in the 1950s in order to scare the people, and you scare the people and you get appropriations from Congress. Now, the bomber gap never existed. They said there'd be 1,000 bears and bisons. They got about 156 today. And then there was the missile gap in the 60s, which existed to our advantage. We had more missiles in the 60s than the Soviets had, but all to get appropriations. Then there was President Reagan's window of vulnerability, which the Scowcroft Commission slammed the door shut on. There was no vulnerability. They talk about the synergistic survivability of our other 2 legs of our triad and so forth. So systematically, the population of this country has been frightened into giving appropriations to the military-industrial complex. It's that simple.
But if your brother-in-law works for General Electric or McDonnell Douglas or North American Rockwell, and somebody says the Russians are coming, you're going to say, yeah.
$1 billion a year
Yeah, he's got 2 kids and a mortgage.
Okay.
The guy's over his head already, and his wife's mad at him because he hasn't cut the grass. He's got to have an income.
$1 billion a year spent on the military creates less jobs than if you spend it on construction, roads, a number of things.
Good point.
How about paying for dismantling? Why don't we go and offer, you turn in a missile head and we'll pay you so much money.
A little incentive.
Right, right.
Good old capitalists.
My question is for Mr. Newman. What do you suggest that we do as individuals?
I mean,
you have a little more influence than we do.
Well, as I said at the beginning of the program, we're not loud enough and we're not noisy enough. In other words, there are the people who say, well, I just don't know how to write my congressman. Those are the people that are submarining us in the long run. Because if the letters came in commensurate to the percentage of the population that wanted to call a halt to all this foolishness, then you'd find that you could create enough of a wave.
We threw a bombshell and abruptly dismantled our missiles without treaty talks or...
What do you think?
I don't know. I'm asking.
Are you concerned? What do you want to do? Now, you stood up.
I'm a fatalist. I believe that if they're going to do it, they're going to do it. No, all the talk in the world isn't going to persuade them.
You're just sitting and you're waiting for the big one, aren't you?
Why not?
Let's get a guitar. Why don't we get a guitar, a little soft music, and we'll just sit down. Is this fair to our children to give up like you appear to have
But
done?
they're going to do it regardless of whether
No, they're
we have
not.
They're not going to do it.
The American people can stop this if the American people take advantage of the fact that they have the best government in the world. It's the government in which you can get up and say you do not want 5 new nuclear weapons built every day for the next 10 years, and you can get the Congress to turn that around. No other people in the world have that freedom and that responsibility, and every one of you had better start being citizens.
Okay.
I'd like to disagree with Paul Newman when he said that we're kind of escalating this to just keep in competition with Russia, but I think we can't trust Russia, and they've proved it over and over. And I'm not saying they want to start a nuclear war. I think it's just a game they're playing.
No. We're all playing the game. In other words...
But I've heard over and over here today that, you know, we're carrying the ball, and why should we carry the ball?
You mean in terms of disarmament?
Yeah, I hear a lot of criticism against our country, but yet we've got to protect ourselves.
We're not criticizing our country. This is the world's greatest democracy. It's a country in which the people tell the government what to do. That's not true in the Soviet Union. If we do not tell our government what to do, then we don't have a democracy.
Wait a second. Phil, I got to get back to one serious point here. Everybody says you can't trust the Russians, and I think you're absolutely right, unless you got treaties with them. We have 3 existing treaties with the Soviet Union now, and to the best of the knowledge of the people in this Standing Consultative Committee in Geneva, that they have tried to sneak around, and they will push it right to the limit, but once they're called, they'll make the change back, and they will not try to violate that treaty. That's simply a matter of fact, guys.
Will Admiral Larocque, who became an ensign
accurate on that?
Yeah, that's right.
in 1941 and was there at Pearl Harbor and has given his entire life, adult life, to the military, what can you say to this woman to make her less concerned about what she perceives to be is the vulnerability of the United States should we decrease or stop matching the Russians in nuclear technology?
Today, we are vulnerable to a Soviet attack. They can destroy us in 30 minutes, and there's nothing we can do about it. We can destroy the Soviet Union in 30 minutes, and there's nothing they can do about it. We both have a problem, and the only way we're going to solve it is to sit down together and try to reduce the increase in numbers of nuclear weapons. It's not a matter of trust. We can see the Soviet missiles in great detail. We can see a golf ball on a green in the Soviet Union. We know exactly how many missiles they have. That's what we call to their attention if they do violate it.
But does anyone really think the Soviets any more than our country are going to play this game with nuclear? No, I think it's a maniac that's probably going to determine everything.
If it's a maniac that does it, that's perhaps out of our control.
What are cruise missiles and Pershings going to do for you against the maniac?
Yeah, I know, that's true, but I'm just saying that, you know, I really don't think it's the Russians we have to be afraid of.
Well, then how come we're spending so much money?
Oh, no, I haven't done it. You know,
The 30,000 nuclear weapons don't protect us from a maniac in any way, and they don't really add to our security. We're worried that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and our weapons in no way protected that. Stop that.
We'll be back in just a moment. Show me that again, Ronnie, the Center for Defense Information. This is Admiral Larocque's outfit. These are folks who made up, a lot of these people are former military folk who think a lot of your military buck is being wasted. You've heard that before, and they wonder whether you've taken it seriously enough. They do not want to disarm and lay down their guns, and they are realists, and they think we have to be protected, but they don't think we're going about it the right way. Box 141, Washington, D.C. The zip is 20044. Look, do you have the audacity to suggest what?
I suggest that all of us in this country ought to get very active, and the first thing I do is call the White House, call the President. Let me give you the telephone number. It's real simple.
Are you kidding?
No, yes. Call, and it doesn't cost very much.
Well, there it is. Now, this is your one. I don't want to be flip about this. All right, as a matter of fact, this is legal, and they work for you. You own the switchboard. Right. The area code is 202, as you may know, 456-7639. Now, we can expect the White House to look with some disapproval on what appears to be a kind of ambush on the part of, you know, the people who want strength, who want peace through strength would like you to call the White House, too.
Everybody should call the White House, what side you're on to the other. Tell the president what you think. That's the kind of country we have.
Yeah. That's another one.
I agree with the woman over there who said it was a game. It just seems there's a big power play between Russia and the United States.
So what do you want to do about it? It's your future, your kids, your backyard. What do you want to do about it?
I want them to stop.
Well, could I say that what we have had, here is a petition that appeared in the New York Times. 1,500 American physicists call for an immediate halt on both sides to the nuclear arms race, joined by 13,000 physicists worldwide.
22
Nobel laureates in our country have signed this, calling for an immediate halt. They're trying to tell you it's too late. We've got to do something very soon if we're going to stop it.
It's not a game.
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to say that I am really glad I came here. I didn't know that much about this. I think when we were brought up to fear the Soviets and consider them as our enemy, but I want to do something about it now. I'm mad as hell.
Well,
Phil.
Let them go.
I don't like the implication that laying down your weapons denies that or shows that you're weak. I believe you can negotiate from the strength of your convictions. If we went into the next treaty with our hands on our hips and said, we've got 1,000 and we'll show you every one of them, I think we challenge them much more than by having 50 or 60 or 70,000.
I think that with the technology that we have today, that we should spend more time trying to make preparations for civilization after a war has taken place.
You want to get ready for the day after, do you? Yes. Well, the ABC movie says you're going to have a long, you're going to have a lot of work on your hands.
But if this prestigious group of people, 1,500 physicists, haven't stopped the politicians, how can we not be fatalistic?
There's been a tremendous change in this country in the last 2 years. 2 years ago, my first son was born, and that's the reason that I decided that I had to do something to stop this. I'm doing what I can do, and when I started out, nobody would come to these talks. And now you can't turn on TV without having an educational show on nuclear war. A lot is happening in this country.
If everybody agreed to stop tomorrow, why would it take 10 years to reduce the stockpile? I heard that on the panel after the
That's right. I think that's a very conservative guess. If the American people want our government to reduce, the Russians, I think, will join if we are fair in our negotiations.
I want to know, how can you be so vulnerable and trust the Russians when we were in the White House signing papers and Japan was bombing Pearl Harbor?
In other words, if the Japanese can sneak up on us, so can the Russians.
Right?
Yeah. You just can't trust those people.
I don't think so.
Yeah. And we'll be, what? Your White House can be reached at area code 202-456-7639.
Well, Paul, with all of your influence and knowledge, why don't you run for president and turn this whole thing around?
Hey. I'll tell you what, I can barely handle what I got, guys.
Services provided and promotional fees paid by the following.
It's just
I don't think we should disarm, but I think we ought to do some sensible negotiations for arms reduction.
We've got to get control of these weapons.
Right.